Good morning. This is Faith in Our Hometown, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin. And now, here's your host, Father Jay Friedel.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us for another Sunday morning at Faith in Our Hometown. Many times on our show, and one of the reasons why we actually started doing this show is we wanted to promote a greater understanding between ourselves as neighbors here in the greater Joplin area. And one of the ways that we define ourselves and organize ourselves here in our area is as religious people or people who belong to a religious body. But very rarely do we get the opportunity to even take a step back beyond that and look at how religion kind of has organized itself throughout the world. One of the reasons why we've invited Dr. Conrad Gubera, who's our guest this morning, to come and talk about this is that he teaches the sociology of religion out at Missouri Southern. And so it's going to be a great conversation this morning. And we knew we were going to have enough to talk about that, not only this week, but next week. So we got a 2-week arc here talking about the sociology of religion. So we're going to be right back after a quick break. We're going to take our Mercy Minute, and then we're going to return for an interesting conversation with Dr. Gubera about the sociology of religion. Stay tuned.
The different bariatric surgical options here at Mercy Joplin includes laparoscopic room-wide gastric bypass, laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy, and laparoscopic lap band placement. In addition, we also offer revisional laparoscopic surgeries for those patients that have had previous bariatric procedures but have had failures. The surgical procedure of choice will vary with different individuals, and so that's why our team will work with the patient on an individual basis to determine which procedure is the best fit for them. All 3 of the bariatric procedures that we offer here at Mercy Joplin have a long track record of proven safety and efficacy. The best procedure for the individual has to be a decision to be decided between the patient and the physician.
Well, thanks again for joining us for another Sunday morning on Faith in Our Hometown. As I said before the break, my guest this morning is Dr. Conrad Gubera. Dr. Gubera has been at Missouri Southern since its inception. And so it's good to have you with us this morning. You're an institution at Southern, and your students absolutely love you. That's one of the things that whenever I wind up talking to students, and they start talking about their favorite professors, if they've had you, your name is usually on the list. So
I think we can stop right now. Just go home after
no,
that.
we've got a couple TV shows, that we got to get done for this week and next week. So, but it is a good thing. And so we're going to talk about. So first, tell them a little bit about yourself and how you came to the area, and what you've been doing out at Southern all these years, and then we'll get started on our topic.
Well, when people ask me how long I've been at Southern, I quote the Bible, say in the beginning, comma, and so. That resonates rather well. I've been there 51 years, and originally I was from this area, so an altar boy, by the way, in the Catholic Church, and knew the Latin rather well, and always had an interest in religion. And then I found out that in the field of my choosing, sociology, which you study people and cultures, that religion is fundamental as far as a world force, a worldview, and certainly a global institution.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit in terms of this sociological perspective on religion. So if I were signing up to take your class, what in general would I learn in this sociology of religion?
I'm going to do some recruiting now. Is that what you say?
You go right ahead.
Or proselytizing if we were in the religious
maybe you
field.
will find a whole new cadre of students out there that want to come take your class.
Well, come on in. I'm the only one that teaches it at Missouri Southern for the last 50 years. And so, those days are probably numbered. But the sociology means literally to talk about, to speak about, and to study. And real sociology has a scientific base, so we have a lot of studies in the field of the sociology of religion, and a lot of questionnaires and case studies and various other forms of longitudinal studies. We do a lot of comparison as far as the behaviors that occur in the name of religion. Less so as far as the creeds and what people do believe, but certainly what goes down, what's occurred in the name of religion, what's expected of you as far as a good, religious person. Right. And so that makes for some really international and certainly, of course, global comparisons, much less when we're looking at the world's religions, much less when we analyze and look at Christianity and see the difference between Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and just Protestantism, just in one religion in and of itself. You know, we look at the sociology of religion from the standpoint of the meaning of religion. The Latin term religiare, which means to bind.
Bind together.
To
To
bind
tie
together,
together,
to tie together.
As in
see?
like ligaments, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was thinking in terms of tying together through ritual, for instance, thought, and certainly, of course, explanation. Golly, where can we start? 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, with those early cave remains, but something was clearly going on as far as human beings were concerned. Now, I always tell students, for instance, take it your way. If you, are going to interpret humankind coming from the Garden of Eden, when they had to leave the Garden of Eden, they had to get out and work by the sweat of their brow. That means that Adam and Eve had to develop culture. See? And culture is what distinguishes human beings from other animal species or other species on Earth. And culture is what we create, for instance, to organize ourselves and to make our life a little bit better as far as artifacts are concerned, and certainly, of course, to keep us to be able to survive. In fact, the basic idea of culture is to have collective behavior that everyone shares so they can meet their needs commonly.
Yeah.
You know, we all have the same needs. We need clothing, food, shelter, and so forth. But how we do this, for instance, becomes a matter of culture. But the idea is getting these needs met.
Right, and so we can step beyond our boundaries, but but human beings naturally organize themselves.
And that organization comes to the fundamental root of the sociology of religion, if not, for instance, all of sociology. You know, it's pretty interesting. I used to always wonder in my younger years, why don't we have, just a major theory in sociology like E equals MC squared or H2O is water, something like this. And the more I've studied and the more I've researched this and the more I've read, I have found out without a doubt that all cultures and all peoples of the world who share a society in which they have this culture to help meet their needs collectively organize it around 5 basic groups. And you can read these in history among the ancients.
Sure.
You can go to the hunting and gathering and the herding pastoral tribes in the Netherlands and find this, and you can see it in modern society.
One of those things obviously is religion.
We're coming to that, Father.
Yeah, good,
So,
yeah.
the five includes certainly, of course, first of all, family, universal. You know, whatever form the family takes, and there are many different forms of family, but whatever form the family takes, it has its basic reasons for existing. And certainly nurturing the young is obviously number one, see, in the protection of the young and continuation of the species, see. And so some form of family. Then there's always some form of religion. Okay, that's the second basic institution. We're going to concentrate on that.
Yeah.
And then the third is some form, for instance, of education, whether it's tool making, what berries to gather, what animals to bring in from the wild, or whether it's to program a computer, or certainly, of course, fix the space station. It's all form of kind of, education and learning. Most oftentimes, all of our education depends upon some kind of skill level, some kind of mastery of skills. And that is the same thing that you might have had education, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, mastering some kind of skill in order to survive collectively and get our needs met. The next institution after that, the fourth one, we refer to as sort of the economic institution or economy. How do you put beans on the table, and bread, and certainly what's your livelihood? And as a result, how do you share in that livelihood? And of course, we know a lot about capitalism and certainly about free enterprise and so forth, but certainly, of course, there have been various modalities throughout all of history about how can we do this better, how can we serve more people better through economics, and certainly that's always, you look at society today, the gap is farther than ever between the haves and the have-nots, so it seems, and so we're told by social pundits. But how do we make our living? And certainly, of course, in your day and mine, maybe I'll be going before you on that sort of thing, but I'm very interested about the role of robots, in changing everybody's lifestyle in the future. But that's never land. And the fifth basic social institution is government. Who's leading? What kind of organization? Who writes the rules? How does it all come about? And so family, religion, education, economy, and government. And if they all work together and they work well, fine. If you're going to revolutionize and overchange, for instance, the country, okay, how are you going to change these 5 basic social institutions? And so, therefore, we find that religion is a cultural universal. It's found in all societies, and it's one of these basic social institutions. And if you look at these 5 social institutions, no matter where you go, stop back and look at them, size up what's happening, you'll have less cultural shock, and you'll have more insight, and certainly, of course, more education about, for instance, wherever you are at that particular point.
Now, some people would say, and maybe even some of our students would tell us that, religion has just brought so much strife and furor and warfare and all these things into the world, that we should maybe eliminate that from your list of 5. Is that even possible, do you think?
No.
Why
No.
not?
Because, and you can substitute other perhaps explanations for religion, but when Homo sapien came out of the garden, or evolved, for instance, from other forms, for instance, began to tick, tick, tick. And various questions began to ask, what am I doing here? Who am I? Who am I? What's it all about, Alfie?
Yeah.
What happens to me after I die? And once we begin to ask those fundamental questions, which can be seen in some form or another across thousands of years of existence, then religion arises to answer those in the most metaphysical way.
Right.
Not necessarily science, not the government, not the economy, but religion. And it touches you in the heart and it touches you in the brain.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartely. I used to tell my students when I was teaching world religions at Southeast Missouri State University, I would say all the time, it's just like, when we start looking at these things comparatively, and we start looking at, what do, Hindus believe versus Christians versus Buddhists versus whatever, the whole matter is that we organize ourselves, by groups according to what we can seem to agree on in those ways. And so sometimes it's a matter of what do we see as ultimate reality, and what do we see as our role in that ultimate reality? What do we see as the end of life? What do we see as the purpose for living? All of those things, and they kind of all, we will, divide according to, well, I see it this way or you see it this way, but does seem to be that thread that runs through all of it. That's one of those ways that we just can't help but seem to organize ourselves. Now, some people would say we're talking ourselves into things, and I guess that's possible. At least I got to consider it, as a possibility. But most people are going to come up with a strongly held belief when they start, sorting through all that to say, okay, here's where I've come down, and there is a God or there isn't a God, or what does that God look like, or what's my relationship or responsibilities to those God, all of those things.
Well, you can say that in some respects about all 5 of those institutions, because what kind of family do we have? Do we have the nuclear family, or is it, for instance, a blended family, or is it a single-parent family, or is it certainly, of course, for instance, the consanguine family where you have 3 generations in the same household? What kind of economy are we going to have? Is it going to be communistic? Are we going to share? And are you and I going to share, for instance, everything, mutually as far as, for instance, the productivity of our individual efforts, or are we going to be a bit on the selfish side, believing capitalism, do the damnedest, for instance, to make the most money that we possibly can? What kind of government? Am I going to kowtow, for instance, to the emperor, and certainly say, yes, sir, the emperor's in China, but the emperor's in Beijing, but that's far, far away. See, what kind of education are we going to have? Am I going to teach my own son, or am I going to hire experts to teach my own son? And if that's the case, sometimes that gets kind of costly. There's a reason why the ancient Romans and the Greeks, only the wealthy people's children got educated, right? Right. The rest of people's children got educated in just basic skills of living and surviving, and contributing to the society. So this whole organization, you've got the key word, it's all a type of social organization, and that's the sociological perspective.
And that's why you're teaching it.
Well, I'm trying.
Yeah, well, that's good.
I'm still learning.
And I love asking these questions because we're going to cut to a break here in a second, but I love asking these questions because it's kind of like you take a step back from the whole thing and you just kind of try to, as best you can, even though we can't really get above ourselves, but it's fun to try to look like at this level that kind of transcends or kind of gets above what we typically get stuck in our regular patterns of relating.
Well, we generally call that a macro level, at this highest, broadest view. And every macro level, however, still answers those fundamental questions which come from the human heart and mind. Who am I?
Yeah.
Where did I come from?
Yeah.
What happens to me after I die?
Yeah.
And there is the basis for religions.
Yeah, there you go. Well, we're going to be right back after a quick break. This is Faith in Our Hometown. Don't go away, all right?
You're watching Faith in Our Hometown on KSN TV, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.
So thanks for sticking with us for another morning here, Faith in Our Hometown. My guest this morning, Dr. Conrad Gubera from Missouri Southern, who's a professor of sociology, and we're talking today about the sociology of religion. And we just talked about getting onto this, trying to get up high enough that we can start to analyze and look at our own levels of the way that we look and the way that we organize ourselves in terms of religion, which is kind of one of the points of higher education. You're just trying to say, okay, how do we, see if we can't get up to where we can't see some things that tie us together and make us one.
Well, organization always has been the human forte. The ancient civilizations were highly organized. Of course, it was nice to have a huge slave population to do all the work, but nevertheless, they were highly organized. And that's how you built the pyramids. Goodness gracious, a tremendous sense of organization there. And so why shouldn't these 5 basic social institutions take on some kind of an organization which in a particular place and time meets the greatest needs of the most people continuously, or certainly, ongoing. See?
All right, now I'm gonna just make a little interjection there. You're not necessarily, you were speaking again as looking from that macro level, that higher up level. So you weren't, sometimes my viewers get a little upset. I said, was he saying slavery was a good thing or any of those things?
Oh, please, no. Well,
but I'm just saying.
For the king, it was a darn good thing. For the pharaoh, it worked well.
For the slaves, not so much.
Oh, well, yeah, but exactly.
Yeah,
Thank you for the correction.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm just saying, so sometimes we do that. And that's what sometimes when, especially teaching, you kind of got to get up above some of that stuff and look at it, because that's how you can get your students to think, If
you can get them to imagine in any way, shape, or form what slavery is, I think you've accomplished a lot. Empathetically. Mm-hmm. Oh, you can answer all kinds of questions about the numbers and so forth, but can you put it in your head what it's like to be so downtrodden and so owned by other people? And we've always been trying to do that in film. The 10 Commandments tries to do a really good job. The old Cecil B. DeMille of Charlton Heston and so forth. Right. But religion's a marvelous thing. We make out of it, it is first of all human created. Mm-hmm. Because it is, I don't believe you can actually find the word religion, can you, in the Bible? I'm not so sure, but if it is, it's very...
in and of itself, right.
In and of itself, see? Yeah. And so that means it's a human creation. And so you have these many wide variations and forms of religion across the world. But within those forms, really, you have dissenting levels. And here it gets a little bit complicated, at least confusing. But so we have these 5 basic social institutions, and maybe you're in an Islamic country, and these all work in a certain way. One of the things we can't understand or we can't appreciate Islam very much, because Islam takes a direct intervention into government. And government is a part, for instance, of what Muhammad taught, for instance, as far as the right and the laws of Islam being involved. Well, that's so foreign to us, we can't even imagine that. But in 100 years, that ideology changed many nations in North Africa and in the Middle East.
Sure.
And it worked for them, see? The same way Christianity has worked for Western Europe, democracy, and certainly, of course, our form and way of looking at our government as well as our social life. But what does religion mean to you as far as your heart is concerned? See, and so in the study of the sociology of religion, we try to take into consideration, Father, various levels of religion. See, right. And we're looking at the big, have been, for instance, macro view of this sort of thing. But let's peel that away and let's take a look, for instance, at levels, of ascendancy from the lowest possible level. What do you believe?
Yeah, what does a person individually believe? Yeah. That's
what we call the lowest possible level. It's called the personal level. You step outside the sea of the stars at night. How do you interpret that? You just some days feel happy and good. You're not necessarily maybe religious, but how do you interpret that, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
And
where's that sense of well-being come from? Yeah.
Yeah. Or if we're very religious, say, God, what a beautiful day! Thank you, Lord, for this wonderful and gorgeous day. See, and it's the personal level. Do you pray? Do you meditate? What do? Do you offer up indulgences for the poor souls in purgatory? As a Catholic boy, we were always taught to do this and that a little bit. The nuns, sure, as I recall, said, offer that up, for instance, as far as a little bit of suffering. Can we suffer? Do we even know anything about suffering? Do we even want to suffer?
Right. Is there a purpose to it?
Yeah, see, and so that's part of the personal expression. How do you suffer and how do you tolerate? And maybe part of the personal expression of religion is just having patience, ultimate patience with other people, and perhaps maybe even a little kinder to yourself. But how do you approach, for instance, this personal level? And in this personal level is where those thoughts come back to haunt you again. What happens to me after I die? Mm-hmm. Is there really heaven and a hell? And what's going to happen to my immortal soul? And certainly every religion gives us what they call, for instance, a creation story. We happen to have a good one in the book of Genesis.
Sure.
But I have come
Actually,
to
you got
the
a couple.
I've come to the
That's okay.
conclusion that indeed, for instance, there's a God, definitely, because there are so darn many creation stories all over the world. There's a different explanation how you and I came into being as human beings, and certainly how the society, how the earth, and how the great firmament came into being as human beings. What do you believe, and how do you believe that, see? And what do you really think in your heart? Now, the next level up from that is what we refer to as the private level. Do you get together, a few friends, and read the Bible? Do you share a fellowship? Do you pray? Do you pray as a family? Gosh, we always prayed as a family years ago. I'm not so sure we do that anymore. Asking blessings for the food, so forth, at least as much as we probably should, to say the least, see? We used to get together, for instance, and certainly do things through the church, for instance, in a certain way of an organization, as a form of fellowship and as a form, for instance, of offering to the church. If you take this to the ultimate, you can say that cults, and we have quite a few of them in America, are really in form, for instance, of this private level, because they're not organized like a sect or a denomination. They most often don't have church. Sometimes they meet in out-of-the-way places in people's homes and so forth. They're many times rather secretive and inclusive about who they will have in a cult. And as a result, for instance, that's also can be seen as a private level of religion, and that just fascinates sociologists as far as cult behavior is concerned, to say the least. See? And we could spend a whole hour just talking about cults if you wanted to. So that's the private
We'll see
level.
whether they want you back for that one, but let's keep going on what we're going here.
So we teach, for instance, after the private level is the church level, or what we call the denominational level.
Right.
Oh my gosh. I'm not so sure anyone throughout the world understands America when it comes to religion.
Because we've got so many.
Oh, hundreds of different churches and sects and cults, and all in the name of Christianity.
Yeah, and that's just that's just with the Christian ones,
Just
right?
for Christians. Let's remember that America's a Christian nation, but it's Christian, and what we used to study, Christian and Catholic, Christian, and Jew. It's not quite like that. Protestant, Catholic, and Jew is the name of a great book out of the 1950s, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And that was a review of religion in America. So when we start talking
even
about...
that's evolved. Even that's changed, obviously in the last,
when we start
60
talking
years.
about being a member of a church, being a member of this church, that church, the first community church, the last community church, the first Methodist church, St. Paul's, St. Peter's, certainly being a member of the Jewish synagogue, we have reached the denominational level. And in America, we have the majority of the Americans being Protestants. So we're referred to as a Christian nation with Protestant. And yet the single largest religious organization is the Roman Catholics, about 80 million people, if not more, for instance, in America. So we look at churches, from what does a denomination and how does it differ from a sect? And what's a sectarian church? And the Bible Belt across the Midwest here is full of sectarian religions. You open the religious page Saturday in the Saturday Joplin Globe and start looking through there, and my goodness, some of those most enchanting and fascinating names as far as churches are concerned, and many of them say Independent Bible Baptist Church, or Independent Church and so forth. They're letting you know they're not hooked up with any hierarchy or organization. They've got no bishop. They're there, the Church of the Wildwood, this sort of thing, see?
Their thing, right?
Yeah, so we have just a potpourri of religion here in the United States that is organized. Some of it's disorganized, but when we talk about organized, we're talking about churches where people go, and it's a sectarian religion, local, governed by a local board, for instance, and local ministers, or a member, for instance, of a hierarchy with the Roman Catholic Church, or certainly the Episcopalian, or the American, the American Baptist Church, or Southern Baptist, and so forth.
United Methodist, right?
Okay, then we reach the top level there, and we refer to entire countries as far as a religious affiliation.
Yeah, because you just, for example, labeled, the United States as a Christian nation.
Absolutely, yeah. We're very firm in that, and yet, for instance, at the same time, Saudi Arabia is very firm in being an Islamic nation.
Right.
And it's kind of sometimes surprising to find out that there are over 70 Islamic nations in the world and growing. Islam is really pressing Christianity today as far as certainly, proselytization and getting new members. In fact, I dare say that Africa is probably the battleground for Christianity and Islam as far as certainly sub-Sahara Africa and the conversion in that area, see. But at the highest level, when we have World Day of Prayer, or when we have, for instance, the American calls for a day of prayer, when we open, for instance, with a Congress with a message from the Bible or a prayer every day, or certainly, of course, when you put your hand on the Bible and say, you're going to tell the truth in the court, for instance, all that is at that highest level as far as, for instance, letting us to believe we are a Christian nation, and upon these principles, we are here, for instance, to pronounce ourselves in relationship to one another.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about how we've, as a society, and from a sociological perspective, from this meta perspective, how we have started to, feel ourselves organized in terms of these things. Let's have a little preview of what we might talk about next week, because we're getting close to the end of our time this week. So this week we kind of talked about how we kind of look at the study of religion, at least from a sociological perspective. We looked at some of the different ways that we've defined in those levels of how it all works. What are we going to talk about next week?
Well, we can continue a bit, for instance, with some of the universal characteristics of religions that are common to all religions throughout the world.
Yeah.
I mean, all religions pray, and all religions have some kinds of the Almighty. And we can move beyond that and take a look at religion in America, if you chose to, certainly,
sure,
in relationship, for instance, to the array of churches and certainly their meaning. And we can certainly, of course, wind up by taking religion, a view of religion and death, and
cool,
certainly religion, and certainly, of course, how it is so important as far as our interpretation and meaning.
Well, I knew when I invited Dr. Gubera that we were going to have more than we could possibly talk about in one week. So we're going to be right back after this Mercy Minute. Don't go away.
The SANE program, or Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program, is a program established to provide a coordinated, specialized care to patients or women or men who've been the victim of sexual assault.
The SANE program is really designed to be a collaborative community response to sexual assault.
It's really important to make sure that it's not just the report or the forensic, but they get all of the testing that might be needed for their health.
It's also important to know that you don't need to know if you want to press charges or not. We don't get law enforcement involved unless you request it.
I just want to express to the victim that it is never your fault. You always have the right to say no, and that it's your body. So if you say yes one time, it doesn't mean every time.
I think it's important that sexual assault victims remember they've been victims of a crime, and crime victims do not pay for those services.
Well, we're glad you've joined us for another week for Faith in Our Hometown. My guest this week has been Dr. Conrad Gubera, and also next week. So if you liked what you were listening to this morning, be sure to tune in next week so that you can hear the rest of the discussion. And we both, in the breaks, have been talking about the fact that we could talk about this all year, of course, and only scratch the surface. But we're talking today about the way that sometimes when we go to look at something, we need to kind of get up above it a little bit and kind of start looking at the different pieces so that we can start to see how the world's kind of organized itself. Obviously, one of those ways that we organize ourselves here in our own area and in our hometown is by religion. And so it's always good for us to get together to have those conversations so that we can share with one another. One thing I'd like to mention to you is that right now, as we're recording these shows, one of our founding folks who had this idea to put this television show together is coming to the end of his life. So please keep him in your prayers, Alzar. Come back and join us again next week for Faith in Our Hometown.
Thanks for watching. Faith in Our Hometown can be seen Sunday mornings at 6:30 and 9 a.m. on KSN. Brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.